Okay, we've solved all of our issues. I'm having a wonderful chat with an amazing pianist, Peter Seivewright. Peter is near Glasgow, right? As we speak, you're living in a
Very
little.
near Glasgow, yeah.
Is it a little village isolated or a suburb of Glasgow or what? Where you are?
People generally think that the all the mountains in Scotland are in the Highlands, as we call them. I actually always think that that term Highlands is extremely pretentious, bearing in mind that the state of Colorado alone has 50 peaks over 14,000 feet, and our highest mountain is just over 4,000 feet, which is a little pimple by comparison. But in fact, the southern part of Scotland is very hilly as well. And I live in the Scottish Hills, about half an hour from Glasgow, half an hour south of Glasgow, in one of the highest populated areas. We're about 1,000 feet above sea level, which is it's one of the most high altitude villages in Scotland.
But I
And
love
it's very,
I love the idea that you live if I may call it a tiny village or hamlet, a half hour outside of Glasgow, and yet you have been all over the world. You have chased all kind of fascinating adventures and interests, including your interests in composers, and now we'll address the issue and get started. Peter has recorded, this will be volume 4 of the complete piano works of Baldassare Galuppi. I hope I'm honoring
oh,
him
fantastic,
appropriately.
fantastic Italian, man. Yeah.
And here's the beauty about this composer. We've had a speech, a chat a little earlier about it. These are the kind of composers that, for those of us who are music majors, and so they're sort of subtexts. They're little lists. Oh, there was Beethoven. Oh, and then there were these others. Blah 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 blah. Nothing. So I'm sure I heard or read the name Baldassare Galuppi and had no idea who this guy was and never heard any of his music until now, the internet age, where all of this is accessible and where you are busily recording his work among zillions of other things. Your interest in repertoire is huge. But let me just give the dates for Baldassare for a moment. 1706 to 1785. He is in the exact center of the 18th century. Mozart, Haydn, the young Beethoven, the young Schubert. He's right in the center of that, and a wonderful composer. I did a little search, and then I'll let Peter tell us more. But Baldassare was born in the Republic of Venice, still a republic, independent, the Senate of Venice, all that stuff. The Kapellmeister for the Doge at a certain point in Venice, and then the Queen, Her Majesty, the Empress of Russia, Catherine the Great, requests the Senate of Venice, may I borrow Baldassare Galuppi for 3 years so I can bring him to St. Petersburg and we can have some culture here and he can teach us a few things. This is Baldassare Galuppi, whom so few people know about, an amazing man. Why don't we just start there? Why did Galuppi come up in your life?
Well, as a matter of fact, Galuppi came up. Incidentally, you're quite right. I spent 3 months in Venice at one time, uh, researching and looking up all the original manuscripts. And I had some Italian lessons before I left. And my very amusing Italian teacher, she always really got at me when I said Galuppi. You got it right. Galuppi. Galuppi. Just think of Italian waiters serving pizza. So, gosh, am I going to get done for racism on that? I'll say, anyway, never mind. The Not very politically correct in Scotland, you understand.
Ah,
No, as a matter of fact, Galuppi came to my attention before the internet age, just about 20 years ago. Now, a little bit of a story to this. I just recorded the complete piano music of Carl Nielsen for Naxos. And Carl Nielsen is another of my great people.
incredible man.
And
Yeah, composer.
oh, just like Galuppi, a one-off. Digressing a little bit, but Nielsen, he has nobody. He doesn't follow on from anyone and doesn't found a school. He's an absolute one-off composer. And Galuppi in many ways is the same. Now, anyway, it had been a lifetime ambition since I was about 15 years old to record Nielsen's complete piano music. And I'd finally done it, aged about 40. I'm 64 now. Yeah, just at 41, I think I was. Anyway, and I couldn't have been more pleased. The recordings were great. Naxos were really pleased with them. They became, not that this benefited me financially, but they became two of the best-selling CDs ever of piano music in Denmark. And it was good. Now, I couldn't have been more pleased. But as anyone knows, when you've just achieved, and I couldn't have been more pleased with the way the sessions had gone, marvelous piano, marvelous everything, Naxos were great to work with. When you've just achieved a lifetime ambition, you can feel a bit of a hole in your life. It's a strange thing. You're pleased, but you don't want to rest on your laurels. You want you just feel a bit, well, what's my next? Just confidence that one of your great motivating forces has you've done it. Anyway, I was slightly in this frame of mind. Of course, I was giving recitals all over the place, as I always am, piano concerto performances. And at that time, I taught jazz piano. I'm also a jazz pianist, although first, foremost, and always a classical concert pianist before anything else, but also a jazz pianist. And at that time, I was teaching jazz piano and music analysis, 18th century and 19th century music in particular, at what was then the Royal Scottish Academy of Music in Glasgow, now with the very praiseworthy addition of a classical ballet program, the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland. And one of my jazz piano students, and very good student, excellent female student, and we got to the end of the lesson, we were just talking, I said, what are you doing in classical piano at the moment? And she said, oh, I've got, she said, my teacher gave me, she said, I've never heard of the composer. Who is it? Galuppi. And I said, well, I've never heard of him either. And I hadn't. As you say, in those days, it might have been a footnote in Grout or something, but that was the end of it. And I'd never heard of Galuppi. And I said, oh, come on, play it to me. And it was 2 pages of music. And I was absolutely transfixed by this amazing melodic genius. And so I'm not at all exaggerating here, with sort of Gershwin-like memorability of melody. And I thought, who is this guy? Why isn't he? Why don't we know about him? And that was the start of my, great involvement with Galuppi. I've now, I think, recorded about 40 of the piano sonatas, got about another 80 to go. And it was that, of course, many others. I have many other sort of reasons for being as classical concert pianist, obviously. But Galuppi became a massive thing in my life, and it was thanks to to that one student who it was a pure chance thing. Now, as you say, now we have the internet. It's a bit easier to find, and people are republishing old 19th century editions of Galuppi. If I can just make a slightly general point, digressing a little bit, a lot of people, actually, it's a slightly political point in a way, but I think the sort of leftist-ish orthodoxy, the 20th century in the West, in many ways, the 20th century was not such an exploratory period as people like to think. Of course, the 1960s saw great, fantastic, and very necessary social changes, huge experimentation in music and everything. But we shouldn't forget how exploratory the 19th century was, with its fantastic advances in science and arts. And I found, interestingly, I mean, of course, we don't like the editions now, the 19th century editions. They seem very dated. But in fact, these composers who were sort of not airbrushed out, but who were slightly neglected in the 20th century, were in fact better known in the 19th century. And a lot of the editions I've used as my basis have come from the 19th century. Also, the Royal Scottish Academy of Music and Drama, as it was then, very kindly gave me a free term to go and sit in Venetian libraries with my absolutely fantastic. They're right on the Galuppi manuscripts. They're on the Grand Canal, and it's beautiful weather. It's the summer weather, and I just went into this library after a nice Italian breakfast and looked at all these manuscripts of this marvelous music, and of course, the windows go down to canal level, so the water was pretty much lapping at my feet. And I must say, I thought this is the life, and I should very much record my thanks to the Royal Scottish Academy of Music and Drama, as it was at that time, for giving me that opportunity. Because from that I was 3 months, I think, in Venice, and I made editions of nearly 40 piano sonatas in that time.
Let me jump in now.
That's a big step forward.
Let me jump in because we have not even properly identified you. Peter Seivewright studied at Oxford, postgraduate study at the Royal Northern College of Music in Manchester. Am I okay so far?
Absolutely correct.
Yeah,
and
okay.
neither of those institutions have ever changed their name. I don't think Oxford ever will change its name.
You know what I can't get over is how all of a sudden conservatory in English-speaking countries is now conservatoire. I mean, it's like
Yeah.
Richard III is back, like the Plantagenets are back or something.
I couldn't agree more. Why we don't use the Royal Scottish Academy of Music and Drama as it was then. Obviously, it would have been a bit cumbersome. Royal Scottish Academy of Music and Drama, blah 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 blah. So they had to change it. But why people use the word conservatoire, I have no idea.
It's recent. It's a recent development. And I'm a Trinity College of Music, I guess, associate.
Oh, right.
Studied there in the 70s, and now it's it's Trinity Laban Conservatoire of Music and Dance.
I don't understand that. I would like to say I'm not not strongly political, but it's this. I don't know. There seems some people in the United Kingdom, they seem to think it's terribly flashy to use a French word for some reason.
Also, the Australians have turned all their conservatories into conservatoires. The Melbourne Conservatoire.
To me, conservatory. There's a perfectly good English American word.
Thank you very
conservatory.
much.
And if it was up to me, I don't like the word conservatoire either. And I have to say, with all I have to be careful here. Nobody has greater admiration than me for the great industrial city of Birmingham in England. But there is something about the words Birmingham and conservatoire which just do not go. It just isn't a good mix.
I am seeing. We have to get. We have to get back on.
I'll let you know when I get a letter from the principal of the Birmingham Conservatoire.
Okay. And we do have to get back on topic. But I can. I'm a Yankee. I spent 3 years in Britain, but I never got to Manchester. But I know exactly what you're talking about because I see a visual image of Manchester, and I'm seeing an oily, grotty, coal-burning industrial town.
The great industrial cities.
Yeah, of course it is. Okay, now let's get back on point. So studied at Oxford, all that we've spoken about, professor in residence. But here I mean, I'm jumping ahead here, but just to let everybody know that you're not just walking around pretending to be somebody inaugural. But here's what got me so intrigued. We spoke earlier about wanderlust, and I'm thinking of Galuppi. By the way, his music is so gorgeous because he was apparently famous for his comic operas, which means...
It was indeed, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, which means easy tune, beautiful tunes, all that. Anyway, in terms of you, Peter, you too have been around the world. I just can't believe whether the jobs came at you or you came at them, but this business of being the first professor of piano performance at the Phnom Penh International Institute of the Arts, you're teaching in Afghanistan, in Kabul. What is that adventure that is why you live in a little village in Scotland but traverse the planet? What is it in your life?
It is. It is a little bit of a Scottish thing. I feel myself to be very, very much a Northern European, and I am. In fact, I was born in England, but my grandfather was the last actual real born and bred Scot, but all my genes are from the very north of Scotland, Orkney, Caithness, the Northern Isles. I'm a real Nordic, and I see this in myself hundreds of times a day. And I think part of being a Northern European, a strong part of being a Northern European, is a bit of a slightly desperate desire to get away from the gloom, to get away from the darkness. You know, we can go for a couple of months without seeing the sun, and Nielsen, I keep coming back to Nielsen. His wife, as I'm sure the well-informed listeners of this uh, film will know his wife was a very famous sculptress, and he went with her to Greece because she wanted to study Greek sculpture. And he finally really saw the sun for the first time, and he wrote his Helios overture. And it's such a Northern European thing. Wow, the sun, it shines all day. So he wrote the Helios, Greek for the sun, of course. And I think it is. And if I can just say, Scots have always been very, considering we're only 5 million now, perhaps 6 million out of 60 million in the United Kingdom, something like that. But they have always been exceptionally highly represented in the British Foreign Service. And it is a slightly Scottish thing. The enterprise in Scotland, we like to get around, but I think a lot of it is slightly to do with escaping the gloom a bit. But actually, in all honesty, having said all of that, it's really just getting my work around. I like to play to different audiences. It's very interesting to me to see what audiences in Cambodia or Vietnam or Jordan or the United Arab Emirates or anywhere else, what music they like. And if I can just say one thing in conclusion, this makes me sound fearfully earnest, which I think my manner gives away. I don't really think I am.
Let's see.
But another thing that has been a big part of my life since, curious enough, also 1995, when I mentioned I recorded the Nielsen piano music, around that time, I happened to read an article in the Daily Telegraph, one of the London newspapers, generally reckoned to be the Conservative newspaper, but it has the great strength that whilst its editorials tend to be a bit conservative, its news coverage is absolutely impartial. It absolutely, it gives editorials, anti the Conservative Prime Minister like no one else. It's very, very independent-minded newspaper. And I read an article in that newspaper by Prince Charles, the Prince of Wales, who said, this was actually just before I recorded the Nielsen in 1995, and he wrote that he thought the great challenge of the 21st century will be for the West to come to some form of accommodation with Islam. Now, in 1995, that was a revolutionary thing to say. Most people like me barely knew what Islam was. I'm really not exaggerating, a vague idea. And people would say, oh, are they the people that wear turbans? No, that's the Sikhs, and all that sort of thing. And it was an extraordinary thing to say. And I remember, the remark stuck in my mind for some reason. And I remember just talking in a lunch break when we were recording the Nielsen to the fabulous producer of those discs, Gary Cole. And I mentioned this remark to him. Honestly, he looked at me as if I'd come from outer space. He says, what do you mean? And I said, well, we have to look at it. It's on the rise. And now, I think, unfortunately, Prince Charles, very, very ahead of the game comment, it has manifested itself in horrendous ways, as we know, which he couldn't have foreseen. But it's stuck in my mind. My obvious music is absolutely what I live for every moment of my life. My other great passion is philosophy. I read a lot of philosophy, including Indian philosophy. And I recall that, a few noises off there.
Yes, sorry, there's traffic and people coming into the apartment.
Living out here in my isolated house in Scotland,
so you can hear that, yes.
Oh, no, a noise is a dripping tap.
Yes.
It's very like dripping taps.
Anyway, let's try to get back on subject, however.
Yeah, let's get back. But the remark stuck in my mind, and particularly as some, horrendous events in the, unfolded, Twin Towers and all this sort of thing, I developed a very, very firm belief that I wanted to play Western classical music to Muslim audiences. I wanted to teach Muslim students. And I think, as you know, from 2008 to 2011, I was professor of music at the Academy for the Performing Arts at the University of Trinidad and Tobago, professor of music at the Academy for the Performing Arts at the University of Trinidad and Tobago. And during that period, I read, I'm just looking at the book here, A Thousand Splendid Suns by Khaled Hosseini, and which many people have read. And I thought about the Prince Charles. It really stuck in my mind as a pertinent thing, and as the remark that nobody would make if they hadn't really thought about it. And I developed a real passion to play to Muslim audiences and to teach Muslim students. And that's how I ended up in Kabul. But essentially, it's because I just like playing music, and I like different play.
But
I like
also,
playing.
what was your experience with young Afghanis, young Trinidad and Tobago?
Well, the Afghan students were absolutely fabulous. They were desperate. I mean, they you know, they were, you know, braving the possibility of bombs, and you know, hearing bombs go off was a pretty regular occurrence. I was just in Kabul for 3 months, and they would walk through this to attend their piano lesson. And at least one of my students is doing extremely well as a composer in the United States, and has recently written a string quartet for the Kronos Quartet. Mm. But my idea was that we see the passion, and I firmly believe, I really do believe, some people think this is a real, you know, airy-fairy artist's belief, but I really do believe that the study of Western classical music, the appreciation of Western classical music, the practice of Western classical music, I think can do a lot to turn people away from Muslim extremism and things like that. I do really absolutely believe that because I think that Western classical music has a universal spirituality. I think all people of all races, obviously both genders, we hardly need to say that anymore, but except you might in Afghanistan, but of all races, of all spiritual, philosophical backgrounds, everyone can excel in Western classical music. I'm not convinced, for example, that the same thing could be said about Hindustani classical music. I've yet to hear a top-class exponent of Hindustani classical music who is not thoroughly imbued with the Hinduistic tradition and all the rest of it. I'm not convinced that that is universal in the same way. I don't think there have yet been any great Scottish Hindustani classical musicians, and if they are, they will almost certainly be Hindus. But I'm not convinced, and but I am absolutely convinced that Western classical music has a universal spirituality. It gets to the deepest level in everyone, and so, you know, I want to harness the sort of passion that you can see, sometimes very mistaken passion, in the Muslim world. I want to harness that to Western classical music, for the simple reason that I think you're going to get a whole load of great performers as a result.
Very well spoken. Now let's get back back to Baldassare Galuppi. We have to get back to the 18th century here. That explains your travels and your interest, and also let me just make sure everyone is clear that your interest in the repertoire is huge. Remember, we had
very wide interests. Yeah,
we had a conversation several days ago, and Peter Seivewright came up. You recall, Peter Seivewright was here in Santa Barbara for many years. I and a friend of mine would have meals with he and his wife frequently, and your interest was immediate. Oh, I've just found 2 piano concertos of Peter Seivewright. Why don't we, So that is that a kind of energy that you get from your family? Was your father this way? Was your grandfather this way? This kind of total inquisitive curiosity to explore everything.
Rather the reverse in my way. I think it really is just me. I often say to people, I think I was born with the energy of 2 people, and I really do believe that. In fact, during the period I mentioned, when I was professor of music at the Academy for the Performing Arts at the University of Trinidad and Tobago, professor of music at the Academy for the Performing Arts at the University of Trinidad and Tobago, there was the director of orchestral studies there, I was conversing with him, and he said, you know, Peter Seivewright, and then he was addressing a whole load of faculty. He said, Peter Seivewright, he's just told me that he has the energy of 2 people, and he said, I'd like to register. This is a complete lie. He has the energy of 3 people. But anyway, but I think, no, it's just, I was born with a great intellectual curiosity, and I followed it through. And I find that working gives me, it energizes me. It doesn't, yeah, it has. If I could just say one thing, and quickly, this sounds like a terrible sob story, and it's not. But I'm far from it. I hope that I can inspire and encourage others, if that doesn't sound very pretentious. I'm now 64. I feel better, fitter, and generally better than I have done at any time in my life. Better than I did when I was 30.
And it's because when the intellect is alive, the body is alive. That's why we're so lucky in the arts, all of us.
But also, like I said, and this is not a sub story at all. But because when I think what so many people have to put up with, and it's nothing. But when you'll be aware that Scottish people, like with all the Nordic races, Norwegians, Finns, and so on. It's a big generalization, but it's true. We have a slightly dodgy gene which leads us to be susceptible to cardiac problems. And I had quadruple heart bypass surgery when I was 45. So, and again, this is not a big story, big sob story, because when I think what so many people have to put up with. But the fact is that I did lose a few years of my life at that time. Sure. But anyway, complete recovery and all the rest of it. And I only lost a few years, but I'm determined to make up for lost time. But I knew this is a radical thing, but should there happen to be anyone who's facing cardiac surgery and all the rest of it, believe me, you know, it'll be successful, and you've got another 90 years ahead of you. And
thank you for that, by the way, because my very good friend, a very good pianist friend of mine, just had quadruple heart bypass surgery.
Well, please on to him.
Yeah.
What age he?
He's in his late 50s, I think. Guessing. Pianist.
Great.
So anyway, I'll pass your good advice along.
No, and the surgery. It was great when I had it, but it's even better these days.
He was home in 3 days. Boom. You know. Let's talk about. Yeah. You know, this recording came out in 2019, released by Divine Art Records, a wonderful company. You and I've discussed this wonderful company. The recordings themselves are from 2013-14 of the sonatas, and that's fine. You have mentioned before we went on air that there was, you know, things happen, years pass, problems develop. I don't really want to go there just now, because what I really want to concentrate on is my own impression and how, and you can respond to it, of Baldassare Galuppi's music. I always wonder how, you know, this is now the 4th volume, and I always wonder how, when you're looking at such a huge output, how you organize a particular CD. I didn't see any years of composition, but my suspicion is, and you can correct me immediately, is that the sonatas in the beginning of the disc are earlier, maybe from earlier in his career. They're simpler. They're not as complex, and then things get a little more romantic, as you say. He begins to anticipate the late 1700s. Am I anywhere close? Are the early sonatas maybe from an earlier period? They're so simple and delicious and gorgeous and tuneful.
Well, this is a big problem, and I'm not sure. I mean, I dug out plenty of manuscripts when I was in Venice for 3 months in, what was it, 19? Yeah, in fact, just about 20 years ago now, immediately before my heart surgery, actually. And nobody really knows, because the manuscripts are not dated, and it's very, now the people tend to make the assumption. I shouldn't use the word assumption. I like philosophy. It's an inference rather than assumption. Because as you have heard on that disc, some of the Galuppi's style is extraordinarily varied and experimental. And just to make a general point, a bit of a general aside, I'm very absolutely fascinated. The whole music of that era, as we mentioned in casual conversation, I can't bear the term pre-classical. It sounds like a pre-dinner drink, a pre-theatre meal, or just a little something, before getting onto the main act, as if Galuppi and Galuppi, I should say, had any idea that Mozart was just round the corner. And I think there is absolutely, and in fact, I think this is a fact, not an opinion. I'm firmly of the belief that there is no period in music that is so experimental in the entire history of Western classical music, with the exception of the 1960s, that is so experimental as the period roughly 1750 to 1790, something like that. You only have to look, again, not that I like political correctness, but I gather one doesn't refer to the sons of Bach anymore. I think that's considered patronizing. I think the younger Bachs, I think, is the term. Yeah. But you only have to compare C.P. Bach, J.C. Bach, and all the others, Wilhelm Friedrich Bach. They're completely different. And it's extraordinary. And if you just look at the body of music, obviously, in my case, I'm looking at piano music, but orchestral music too, the variety of sound. There is no period of music, again, to use a rather right-on word that is so pluralistic, as that particular period of music, with the exception of the 1960s, which is a different story altogether. But the people do tend to infer that the more obviously Baroque style of Galuppi, that he wrote those earlier in his career, and that he wrote the more involved ones, which, as you say, there are hints of Mendelssohn and Schumann.
Absolutely.
It is quite extraordinary, the range of his stylistic range and his own experimental things, and the experiments with form and all the rest of it. It is quite extraordinary, the variety. People tend to infer that, therefore, the ones that are more Baroque in style were written earlier, and the ones that are more developed and more romantic style were written later. I can see why people make that inference. But with my interest in philosophy, I like facts, like Charles Dickens, 19th century English novelist. Give me facts. I like facts. He didn't like politicians and he didn't like opinions. Give me facts. And I like facts. And I don't think we can ever know. I wouldn't necessarily make that inference, because it's very important to remember that in that era, I mean, through the whole history of Western classical music, including now, people were writing for occasions, and maybe he was just asked to write a shorter one, so he went back to a more Baroque style because there wasn't time. And it's very, very hard to know. And also, many people believe, I don't actually believe this, but I think there's no firm evidence either. Many people believe that he wrote many of his piano sonatas during the period he was in Russia, as you mentioned, at the court of Catherine the Great. And that, of course, has plausibility to it, because we all know to this day the Russian love of piano music, love of the piano concertos, etc. But again, we can't know. It's not like Bach. With Bach, we know that he wrote this in Leipzig, this in Curtin, and we know that. It's documented. You can't know. I would not necessarily make the inference that the more involved sonatas were written later, because we can't know. But nonetheless, I can see why that people make that inference, but I wouldn't take it as certain.
Yeah, I was just so curious, because the earlier sonatas are much simpler. They're almost two-finger, if you forgive my use of the words. They're so simple and clean. And by the way, again, he was well aware, as I read somewhere, of musical theater. And I love that use of the term musical theater. This was comic opera that he was so popular for. So of course he wrote gorgeous, beautiful, fun tunes. And there's a playfulness to all of his writing, I think. And then further down in the CD we have three movement sonatas that are much more complicated, much more,
Yeah.
much fuller, much more late classic.
It's,
If you will.
I don't think there's an answer. The most developed sonata, obviously, as you'll have found, is the three-movement sonata in E flat,
Yes.
which really is. I mean, that's especially the first movement, really. I mean, it really is almost early romantic,
Yeah.
Weber and so on. It really is pushing on to that. Even sort of almost beyond Beethoven, glimpses of that. But I reserve judgment simply because I don't know, and simply, yeah, I'm like politicians. I don't make rash speeches. And the I don't think we can know, but such knowledge as I have on the dating of Galuppi piano sonatas, which is very, very small, really, but from various sources. I won't enumerate them because it would take forever, and it comes from so many. But I tend to the belief that he wrote most of his piano music later in his life, including the more Baroque pieces.
Interesting.
I,
Very
I,
interesting.
I tend to that belief and I think possibly as a result of interactions with other musicians he'd met in Russia, I'm inclined to believe that most of his piano. If you asked me, what is your belief? What is the balance of probabilities, as they say? That's an insurance term, isn't it? The balance of probabilities. And I would say, on balance of probability, I personally think it is most likely that Galuppi wrote almost all his piano music after his return from Russia. But
Okay.
I can't be sure, and I don't have documentary evidence.
So that means the last half of his life, wasn't he? I'm just
Yeah,
guessing,
pretty much.
trying to
Yeah.
remember, but the 1750s or something is the time when Catherine.
Yes, he was relatively young in Russia. No, you put it much
Very
better than I have.
interesting.
It's in the second half of his life,
Yeah,
I
very
would say so.
interesting.
And I think just one thing. I mean, this is circumstantial, and it's not. And any scientist or lawyer would shoot me down for this probably. But you have to remember his first and earliest reputation, which he maintained throughout his life. But he made his reputation in the opera house. We all know that with the opera. Although in fact, probably most of his greatest operas were written later, but that's another thing. But nonetheless, that's how he made his name. And in his case, also a good deal of money. One of the most financially astute composers in the history of music, I think.
Like Handel, he did well. Just as
Well,
Handel did well.
Handel made and lost several fortunes. I don't believe Galuppi ever lost any. Handel ended up rich, but he had some failures on the way. But anyway, he was considerable financier, Galuppi. And my own feeling is that this is it's sort of circumstantial evidence, really, but his opera production was so prolific as a young man before he went to Russia that I find it difficult to imagine that. And I'm personally inclined to the view that I think the advances in piano technology, I think he was more interested, in writing for the new piano and all the rest of it. And his opera production, although in fact probably what most people consider his greatest work in the field of opera, comes from the late part of his life. But he wrote fewer operas as he got older, and I think that's circumstantial.
He was busy with those 160 piano sonatas that he was writing for the Empress Catherine. Was she a pianist at all? I wonder. I don't remember whether she was a musician. Catherine the Great.
As a matter, in fact, actually this is a misquote. It's often quoted that Catherine the Great once said that she couldn't tell the difference between music and noise or something. She couldn't tell the difference between music and noise. Now, in fact, that's a misquote and a mistranslation and all the rest of it. But, because couldn't tell the difference between music and
She
noise.
had the good sense to send an emissary to the Venetian Senate to ask if she could have
Well,
Baldassare for a few years.
The theory is, as I say, it has actually a misquote and mistranslation. You know, I can't tell the difference between music and noise. I can't tell the difference between music and noise. But in fact, it's wrong, and she did have some sensitivity to music. But in fact, and again, I'm not very political, but there's a message for everyone here that what she did recognize, however, you know, to whatever degree of personal appreciation she had of music, what she did realize was the extraordinary luster that music gave to her court, and so on. And it was a very, very essential thing. And the Russian imperial court, nobody was going to, you know, bearing in mind Russia was, you're not supposed to use the back. Oh, I'm too old for political
Feudal.
correctness.
How about feudal?
Oh, yeah, you're not supposed to use the word backward, are you now?
Yeah.
But anyway,
so feudal. Russia was still rather feudal.
It was a fairly an early development country, let's say that, at the time, and you know, perpetually involved in wars and so on.
Yeah.
But
she had to keep up with Peter the Great too. She had to continue to westernize the empire.
Yeah, and but she you know, she realized that the court was nothing without music, and so she was a very generous patron of, and very successful patron of music, at a time when they had great military expenditure and all the rest of it. So good for her.
Okay, we're going to have to wind it down here. We're at 40 minutes. Everyone has nodded off, or we'll be jumping ahead on the tape. So we're going to wind it down, but I just want to do a review. We are talking about a CD, the fourth volume of the complete piano works of Baldassare Galuppi, 1706-1785, just to give everybody that. And we've agreed now that probably most of his output was in the last half of his life, in that milieu in Europe and in Russia. Fabulous experience, fabulous time for this composer. Very interesting, very unique composer, very popular in his own lifetime. We have on this Divine Art CD by Peter Seivewright, 8 of Galuppi's sonatas. I'll ask you some other time about when I see just a single movement. Apparently there was just a single movement that you could find to one particular sonata.
Some sonatas are just single movement.
Yeah. So, and I now see that you were, rummaging through papers, no dates, no nothing. I mean, it's amazing that you assembled all of this. Anyway, 8 of Galuppi's solo sonatas for piano, and then we haven't even had time, and we don't, to touch on it, but as a little bonus, wonderful bonus, with the Scottish Baroque soloists, the piano concerto, the G major piano concerto, and that little nugget of a piano concerto gives all of us listeners an idea, especially with the Scottish Baroque soloists playing, just of the style and finesse and charm of Galuppi's compositional expertise. And again, he was very clever, I think, very clever, very, very original, and some very interesting little harmonic tricks and some very interesting rhythmic figures that are quite unique and fun. So a wonderful CD. Pianist Peter Seivewright, thank you very much. It's probably way past your it's still dark out there in the foothills of.
We changed the clocks last night, so it's a bit lighter in the evenings now.
Ah, good. Okay. All right. Thanks so much indeed for a wonderful chat, and we'll be chatting again. All of this goes up at performingartsreview.net. As you know.
Can I just one thing in conclusion?
Yeah.
At first of all, you've got to understand this is wholly genuine. Scots in general, and me in particular, I never say anything I don't mean, and I tell you why I never say anything I don't mean. Is because if you say things you don't mean, it's a sure way to find trouble. And I do not want trouble in my life. I want a nice, quiet life where I can practice the piano all day. So I don't look for so. But I really mean, it's always a pleasure to give interviews and talks to a United States interviewer and a United States audience, because as you will see from my CD discography generally, one of my other many great passions is American piano music. And actually it sounds like a little plug, but let me say it, I'm also doing a series of American piano sonatas for the Divine Art Recordings group. And I genuinely believe, I know that all of you, if I can just, sorry, it sounds very pompous, I'm addressing an American audience, you know, as if I was some, you know, the president of Moldova or something, you know, but I'm not. But just to say, we're keenly aware that many of you in the United States feel that the United States is going through a little bit of a crisis period at the moment, and dissatisfaction with many politicians, not only with your president, but with many other aspects. And we understand that. But I firmly believe, I have the unshakable belief that the United States of America is the greatest country the world has ever seen. One of my most treasured books is David McCulloch's biography of the early American president John Adams. And to me, the United States, to me, America is a continent. I'm always strange, you know, it's the United States to me. America includes Paraguay and Guatemala and everywhere else. And I firmly believe the United States of America is the greatest country the world's ever seen, and the only country in the world which properly understands freedom, and that the proper understanding of freedom, my philosophical interests again, is perfectly expressed in your Constitution. So in addition to Galuppi, and of course in many ways this is a big subject which we haven't got time to go on to, the independent Venetian Republic where Galuppi worked, it was almost like a mini, you know, very capitalistic, a mini United States. But that's something else. They got absorbed into Italy and all the rest of it. And I'm not a Scottish independence fan, by the way, just to tell you. And but the United States has produced phenomenal music, absolutely phenomenal music. So my next great thing, working in tandem with Galuppi, is I've recorded half of my next American piano sonatas CD. So keep an eye out for that series too. And
what are some of the composers? I know you have one out already. I've seen.
Yeah, I've got the composers on the. There's a series within a series. My first American piano sonata CD featured, fittingly enough, the Scottish-Irish Edward MacDowell's fourth piano sonata, which is the Celtic, and his third piano sonata he called the Nordic. He was very into, you know, Scottish, Irish, Nordic legends, as you know. He indeed was of Scottish-Irish background himself, and as was Grieg, of course. But anyway, that's another thing. Sorry, Scots are always going on about this. We're always claiming, because there are so few of us, you know. Grieg, he was a Scotsman, really, you know. Anyway, MacDowell had a Scottish grandfather. Actually, the Danes claim Grieg as well, because he wrote his piano concerto in Denmark. But anyway, the second CD will include MacDowell's third piano sonata, the Nordic, which I have already recorded, and of course, perhaps the great titan of all American music, Charles Ives' Concord Sonata, which I think of all music, I love Galuppi, Nielsen, but of all music, I think, well, I have to exclude Bach from this, because to me, there's Bach, and then, you know, Bach's in a class. But well, that was my mother's view. It's my mother's view, and it was who was not a professional musician. Was not a professional musician, but she, like me, as I played some Bach at her funeral a few years ago, and I introduced it. She'd asked me to play some Bach in a letter she'd written before she. Well, sorry, a letter she'd written before she died. Of course, she wrote it before she died. But anyway, which I read after she died, I should say. And she asked me to play some Bach at her funeral, which of course I did. And indeed, I had also played some Bach at my dad's funeral. 5 years previously. But I played some Bach at my mother's funeral. I introduced that by saying that my mother had the same idea as I do, that there is Bach, and then there is all other music. And so we take Bach. But with the exception of Bach, I can honestly say there is no single piece of music in the history of Western music that I feel philosophically and spiritually closer to than Charles Ives' Concord Sonata. And I've been a little bit slow I wanted to give it, a great many performances. Played it in Kuala Lumpur recently, but I should be recording that later this year, and that will be on the second American Piano Sonata CD. Will be Charles Ives and McDowell.
Wow. Wow, and they're both from the. We have to end this. It's 50 minutes now. People are long gone from watching this. But
not enough listening to me.
What an amazing thing! McDowell and Charles Ives, both really from the same period in history, the late 19th, early 20th century. Ives lived till 1947, but Ives preferred the good old days, the 19th century, and yet their music is just so completely different. Anyway, we got to end it now.
Hate to correct you. Ives lived till 1954.
Was it 54? That's right. You're quite right.
I happen to know that because it's the year of my birth.
Of course. And besides, you're studying him. Thank you for that correction. But I think what I'm getting at is that Ives said often that he missed the old times, the picnics in the park in the late 19th century, the bands, all that you hear in his music. So, and yet he was such a progressive composer, such amazing, totally, utterly, completely unique as a composer. Peter Seivewright, we have to end. Thank you so much. For a wonderful.
No, thank you so much. And I could, very final point. Sure. It's marvelous. I don't regard this as an interview. I regard this as a conversation between two musicians. It makes all the difference but I know you will describe it as an interview, but it makes all the difference when you're actually talking, to a distinguished fellow musician. It's like my wonderful concert agent in Glasgow, Daisy Henderson. She's a singer. She worked with Scottish Opera for many years. And it's marvelous to have a concert agent who is actually a practicing musician. It makes all the difference. And we don't have any of the formalities because, to use a rather Ivesian cliche, we're, as you might say, singing from the same hymn sheet. Not that I have any religion, but they, as you say, love marching bands and all. No, thank you so much. An absolute pleasure to talk to you. And thank you very much indeed for your interest in my work.
My pleasure. I'm glad. I discover things all the time. That's the great joy for me. And this was one of the great discoveries.
We share massive intellectual curiosity, both of us.
Well, thank you to both of us for the compliment. Peter Seivewright, thanks so much. And I'll have this up, I think, this interview up in another couple days. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Absolute pleasure.